If you clicked on this video, it's because you want to decrease your pop time. And before I show you how to do that, I want to show you two different catchers and I want you to ask yourself 3 questions. The first is, what do you think these catchers' pop times are? Which catcher would you recruit? And which catcher do you believe would throw out more runners? So we have catcher number 1. And we have catcher number 2. Chances are that you said catcher number 1 and that you would recruit this guy and he would throw out more runners, because both of these catchers put up pop times in the 1.9s, but one of their throws looks completely different. You see, most catchers rush their throws and don't even realize that if a college coach saw you throw like this, it wouldn't matter what your pop time was because they wouldn't be interested in you in the first place. So if you want to throw low 1.9s with a throw that college coaches actually think is legit, you need to stop rushing your throw and understand 3 things. We need to understand how the throwing sequence works, how pop time is either increased or decreased in the optimal positions to get to, and how to do all of these things in a way that actually translates to a game. When we hear the term throwing sequence, we want to think sequence of events. So essentially, that's all of the pieces of our throw that need to work together to lead to a successful throw. And we would say that the throwing sequence has 5 separate parts. So the first part of the throwing sequence is essentially going to be our momentum and our direction into the throw. And the key thing with the first part of the throw is it's everything that's happening before the ball hits our glove. So we can see that this catcher creates a good amount of momentum and direction into his throw, but he's not overextending past his backside. So this is really clean. And if we watch this catcher, he does create momentum into his throw, but what we notice immediately with him is his hips are peeking out towards the right-handed batter's box. And we know that in order to put up good exchange times and good velocity, any inefficiency like this is going to show up later in the throw. The second part of the throwing sequence, after that ball hits our glove, is essentially the transfer, rotation, and planting of the back foot. That's the second step of the throwing sequence. And ultimately, what makes a good transfer, rotation, and planting of the back foot is how quickly we get the back foot engaged with the ground. So this catcher travels about 6 inches, does a pretty good job of staying connected to his backside and keeping his rotation tight. Whereas this catcher, we can see his transfer would seem to be a little bit longer and down and around. And the reason for that is everything that's happening earlier in the sequence. So if his hips push out, naturally that transfer is going to have to push low and come down and then back up before he re-engages with his backside and connects that back foot. So most of the time, our transfer is going to be a result of everything that happens before it. Now, once the lower half initiates our momentum and direction, we transfer, rotate, plant the back foot. This is the most important phase for generating velocity, and we call this the separation phase. So essentially, that's the separation from the front side away from the backside. We think of this like stretching a rubber band. The harder I stretch this rubber band, the harder I'm going to get pulled through and create extension and backspin and velocity. So the separation piece of the throw is by far the most important if you're a guy that wants to create velocity and backspin and have a throw that you can get off quickly without sacrificing velocity. Oftentimes when this is done improperly, in this example, when this catcher's hips swing out, it causes his transfer to be long. Another thing we'll notice about this catcher is he disconnects very far from his back foot. So partially because his hips have swung out and partially because he's lunging forward, he's very disconnected from that back foot. And now that back foot needs to travel a long way before it re-engages his backside. And then this catcher either has 2 choices. He can not separate that far, or he can separate way past the plate. And then anytime we end up this far past the plate, this throw is not going to translate to a game, because if you watch any big league catcher, their front foot often lands right at the back part of the plate. So this catcher is going too far, and we can see how a lot of this is just happening because of how he starts his throw with his momentum and his direction. And then the fourth piece of the throwing sequence after that separation happens is essentially us tucking the glove and then our arm spiraling through to release. So what this looks like when it's done properly is we see a strong glove pull. We see this tuck right here that starts to flip the arm back and down and initiate that spiral. And then we want to keep this baseball as tight to our body as possible in an attempt to apply as much force to that baseball as we can. The tighter we keep the spiral, the harder that thing's going to come out of our hand. But if we try to find this engagement late, that's when we can see guys kick their hips out, pull their head to the side, and start to spin off this baseball because everything is finding engagement late, which causes us to ultimately lift that release point a little higher than it should be. And then the fifth piece of the throwing sequence is essentially the rhythm and timing, the glue that holds all of this together. So when we watch really good catchers do this, they have really good timing with the actual pitch coming in, which allows them to lead into that first step of the throwing sequence really well. Now, if we want to manipulate our pop time, we have to understand where pop time actually comes from and how to get that number down. So pop time is essentially just a measurement of the efficiency of our mechanics. So if we want to have more efficient mechanics, we need to understand the optimal positions that we're trying to get to, and then we need to get to them as fast as we can in order to get that number as low as possible. So a few benchmarks that I look for when I work with my guys is position that they're in when the ball hits the glove. When I see the ball hit their glove, I want to make sure that they're very connected to their backside. So if we look at this catcher's back shoulder, back hip, back knee, and back foot, he doesn't go that far past it, which allows him to get that back foot planted very soon. If we see a catcher that is overextending from their backside, often when the ball hits their glove, their hips are gone. They're either to the side or too far forward. The reason this is inefficient for pop time is as far as we extend past this back foot, we're going to need to take that same amount of time to get it back underneath us, which is ultimately adding to our exchange time and taking away from our velocity or time behind the baseball. Another big thing we look at is how quickly a catcher can get into engagement once their backside hits. So a lot of times what we'll have our catchers do is you want to almost think to preset your throwing arm. So you can see this catcher is pinched through his scaps. He's very much engaged through his posterior chain. So then finding this engagement when the back foot hits happens very early. Whereas if we break posture and kind of dip forward, a lot of times it's going to take more time to find the engagement of our backside. You can also see that this catcher right about here is where he starts to engage his scap and his backside. And it's all happening a little bit too late, which is why we see him throw his head back and try to get over the top. Another big thing we want to look at is the front side. So when we are about to rotate into that front hip, I want to see a clean line between my knee and my front hip in line towards our target at second base. The cleaner we're able to rotate into this front side, the more extension we're going to create and the harder we're going to be able to throw that baseball. Whereas if we land and our front side is closed, we're going to have to fight across our front hip in order to get to release. That's when we see all of these inefficiencies start to show up in our throw. And when we're dealing with margins as small as pop time, all of these inefficiencies actually do matter. So by understanding what the optimal positions are and where pop time actually comes from, you can start to train in a way that promotes the best positions. A lot of times we'll see catchers that just do random drills without really understanding where they fit into the overall throwing sequence. So if you can understand the throwing sequence as a whole and then the optimal positions to get into in each piece of the throwing sequence, now you can work on each piece of the sequence individually and start to build your entire throw from the ground up. So starting with that momentum and direction that we see while maintaining good backside connection, a tight transfer, rotation, and planting of the back foot, maximizing separation, and then pulling through really hard. If we can start everything from the beginning and understand the throwing sequence as a whole and where each piece fits in, you're going to have a much easier job breaking down your throw and actually fixing it in a way that translates to games. If you're a high school catcher that wants help building a throw that doesn't only look good in showcases, but also shows up well in games and improves your ability to get recruited and play at the next level, you can apply for the Drop Your Pop Time program. The best way to do that would be messaging us the word Pop Time on Instagram. We'll ask you a few questions to understand your situation and see if the program actually makes sense for you.